Hi, and welcome to another episode of So You Want to Be Off Grid. Today we will be talking about Axel and what a good boy he is. No, we won't. But thanks a lot, everybody, for watching and liking. It's real inspiring for me to be able to share my experience and information with anyone who is wanting to make this move. As I've said before, I'm no master anything, just a worker bee gone rogue. General tool proficiency is about the top of my skill level. I have no building certs through OSHA. Nevertheless, through YouTube and humility, I've learned what I needed when I needed to. Power was a big one. Yeah, we're going to go solar, right? Well, there's a lot more to it. Even just what size cable you're using is a very big factor. So that was definitely quite a learning experience. I guess the first place to start would be converting the math and being able to spec out. There's a very basic equation. It's volts times amps equals watts. And so everything will have one of those ratings, depending on what you're buying. Solar panels come rated in watts, batteries come rated in amp hours. Your solar panels also have voltage. Some of them are voltage specific, some of them are not. So it's a lot of converting. So that formula, volts times amps times watts, that'll be your homeboy. When you look at something that you want to plug in, you're going to see ratings for all three of those: volts, watts, and amps, and even hertz. You'll even see it, although everything here is in 60 hertz, so you don't got to worry too much about that one, but you will see that number 60, and in other countries I think it's 56. It's a very close but not the same. So where do you even start? Well, when you're trying to determine a load on your system, I factor through amps. Amps is pretty steady throughout voltage, throughout different system voltages. So I always calculate to the highest amperage, as a lot of different things will have different ratings. They'll get lower and higher. You'll have a low and a high speed on a fan, stuff like that. So I always try to plan for the highest. Again, you're generating and storing this power, so you want to be careful. You don't want to overuse it when you really need it. An example is like my swamp cooler. My swamp cooler is rated for 1.4 to 2.1 amps. That rating is at 120 volts, your typical house power. While my solar inverter is converting my power to 120 volt power, my battery bank is not set up in 120 volts. Most of the time, you probably won't be. Mine is set up in 24 volt. That means you have to take that 2.1 amp top rating and multiply it by 5. 24 times 5 is 120. So 5 times that 2.1 is 10.5 amps. And that's what it's costing my battery bank. Plus, there's a little conversion fee, too. The inverter costs you energy as well off of the battery bank because it's always doing something. So it's like 35, 40 watts just for the inverter. But that's how it works. It takes the 10.5 amps from your battery at 24 volt and it steps it up to 120 volt, 2.1 amps to run your device. So basically, when you're charging, you want to kind of calculate and see how many amps you're putting into your battery bank during the day. So here's that example. And I'm using my system specifications to make the math easier. Currently, I have 1,800 watts of solar, which running in 24 volts gives me a max charge of 75 amps. I haven't seen that. The best I've seen is 55, but that's a pretty good, that's a pretty decent charge. You could, I don't have much to worry about. Takes it all. Something like my rooftop AC on the motorhome here, That costs about 12 amps max to run. It's 8 to 12 it says, so go for 12. Even though I always run it at low, still banking on 12. That's a tough load on my system. It doesn't charge during the day. Like if I'm running, I'm getting just enough, or maybe even a little less, because I notice the voltage goes down during the day. And typically by about 4 or 5, or a couple hours before dark, I gotta turn it off and let the batteries get a little charge before the night comes. Another caveat about batteries is that depending on what kind you're using, so I'm using flooded lead acid, you don't really want to discharge below 50% of the rated capacity. It just kind of deteriorates the lives of the plates. And so basically, like my system voltage, where I have 450 amp hours of total storage, I can only really use 225 amp hours of that. So my 12 amp air conditioner, which costs 60 off my battery bank, can only run 3 or 4 hours before I'm done. And there's a setting on the inverter that will shut it off when it's too low voltage. Boop, inverter shuts off. And it's no big deal. Like, it's not going to break nothing. That's what it's designed to do, but you're not going to have no power that night. Okay. Let's take a breath. This is a lot. It is. But once you get it, and it's real basic, easy math, I mean, you get it. It's simple, I tell you. So battery configuration is going to determine your system voltage. Batteries come in all different size voltages from 2 volts. Who knows? Maybe they even make a 200 volt. I don't really know. I never really much looked further than 6, 12. There's 24, there's 48. There's probably 96. There's definitely 2. So you just, whatever. I'm using 6 volt golf cart batteries. They're just, everyone's recharging them in their golf carts and they're working great. So I charge mine off the solar panels, and they have a nice lifespan. They are flooded lead acid, like I mentioned. So to make the 6 volt individual battery into a battery bank running in 24 volt, you have to run 4 of them in what's called series wiring. And that'll stack your voltage only. That does not stack the capacity. That just stacks the system voltage, what they run in. So if you want to stack more capacity, you have to run a complete other set of 4 of these batteries in 6 volt. And then you run them in parallel wiring. So you have your one set of 4 run together in series wiring. And that's accomplished by just plus to minus, positive to negative on each battery, all the way down. And there you have one whole battery out of 4. And then you take the other ones that you've done just the same, and you run a positive to the top and a negative at the bottom of the bank, like whichever direction the energy is flowing. And that's called parallel. So then you're running them series parallel. You've got them strung together in series to create 24 volt, and then you've doubled the capacity by adding 2 of them. It's a lot of cabling at low voltage, and it's pretty high power, so you typically use fine stranded copper, and you want to use a thick gauge. For all these pathways where it's required, I use 2 gauge thin strand. However your voltage setup exists, there's going to be a few more pieces to the puzzle. The panels don't just plug into the battery bank. They hook into a charge controller, which controls the charge. I know, it's crazy they name this stuff. The sun and panels don't collect at a steady 24 volts, and it's not an even stream, and it needs to be regulated. So charge controller is also where you're going to have your first line of circuit protection coming in. Before it even enters that, it should be circuit protected. There's a couple other little features of the charge controller. It prevents overcharging, like we'd mentioned about undercharging and not powering the inverter. You don't want to overcharge them, so kind of has that feature. Also, you'll usually get some kind of little display showing, what you're collecting, maybe what you've stored, what you're using, different features, different models, different capabilities. The Charge controllers, for the most part, are voltage specific, although you could buy some nice fancy ones now they're coming out with that'll read multiple system voltages. You just plug them in and they'll tell you, hey, over here. And they're usually also sold in amp ratings because, like I was explaining about the charge, you're counting your amps, so you want to watch yours. An understanding of that relationship would be to think about your normal house. You could have 200 to 400 amps of service coming into your home. So my 75 amps, I'm getting there, it's only 4 years. So 75 amps is pretty good. My controller, the actual charge controller that I'm using, is rated for 440 amps of input with 3 different input types and 3 different circuits. So the wind turbine basically plugs right in with a couple little wind turbine stops. But, and again, all the panel wiring to the charge controller is also thin strand cable. It's not solid because we're still at low voltage. We're still at 24 volts. What's funny about cable gauge is that as the numbers go up, the cable gets thinner. So I don't understand. I guess we're going to get to a point where it's just going to be so thin. I don't know. Whatever. That's just how we do it. So, but you want to be within 100 feet from your panels to your charge controller. Otherwise, you're going to start losing rating for distance. You get ohms, which is a whole nother thing. I'm not even going to bother. You'll figure out ohms. But once you get too far on a certain gauge cable, you're going to start losing electricity. So you want to be 100 feet. It's probably about the max you want to be. It is the max you want to be. And then so there's still more, because now you've got your batteries charging, but what are you plugging into? You mean you can't just plug into the batteries, so that's where your inverter comes into play. And I gave you a little sneak peek about that earlier, talking about the conversion, how you're taking the 10 amps from the battery and making it 2 amps for the device. So the inverter is doing a lot. The inverter is your jam, and there's definitely different ways you can hook up your inverter. Some of them have AC outlets. You just plug right in, and they're typically on an inverter, they're 15 amps per plug, which, it's not the greatest, it's not the worst. You got power, right? So some of them, like mine, it has what's called a terminal block connector, and that distributes the whole load of the inverter to one spot. So what I did was I made a 30 amp female plug for my motorhome, shore power plug, and I just plugged the whole motorhome in, and she's hot. For this run, coming out of the inverter, it is 120 volts, so you're going to want to use thick, you're going to use solid copper for that run. And depending on how much power you're sending, will determine your gauge, but you're going to want it solid for a high power like that. So an added bonus of me hooking up my shore power all the time is that the coach batteries on the motorhome always get a little charge. So like for the lights and the water pump and the heater blower motor, those batteries are always charging. So I could theoretically hook up another 12 volt motor, 12 volt inverter to that battery system and kind of just be getting some more free power off my free power. I really wrote that. When you're buying an inverter, and it's important to make sure it's pure sine wave. I'm not going to go too far into the mechanics of pure versus modified sine wave. Just, it's the type of power you have in your home, pure sine wave. A generator is, a gas loud generator, that's modified sine wave. And so you all heard the surges, that's what your power is doing. So make sure you buy a pure sine wave inverter, whatever size. My inverter is 4,000 watts of pure sine wave. Now that doesn't mean that that's what you're running. I'm not sitting here running 4,000 watts consistently. It's what I can run at, but you're really running off your batteries. You're running off your solar charge. So, it'll power it, but for how long? If I'm trying to run 4,000 watts, I might drain my battery even full charging during the day. And you never want to run it full. It's sensitive electronics. You never want to have it on full blast. I don't even think I touched 3,000 running watts, you know, but it's good to spec up. It's good to buy bigger. It's good to make sure your gear is compatible with each other, and it's good to make sure that you can stack your gear up, you know. Maybe charge controllers are a costly, important part, and a lot of them aren't rated much over 100 amps, you know, so you're going to end up being stacking them. You're going to stack multiple ones, and so you just want to make sure everything is proper with each other. Then that doesn't even necessarily mean same brand, you know, it just means that it's got an outlet and an input, you know, I mean, it's all cables and input and output. Now, sure, maybe the fancy displays won't work, you know, they won't talk to each other through Bluetooth, but they'll work. They also have 240 volt, which is like, you know, your washer machine or a welder. But it's a separate inverter. And again, I never looked much into that, so I don't understand how it works. If everything works and you get 240, I don't know. It's, you know, I don't have the need for it, so I can't research everything. Choosing your batteries is a big choice. Everybody's heard of these new lithium batteries. They're pretty, you know, they're definitely like a certain temperature, you know, they are the top of the line deluxe models, but they are pretty sensitive. They don't like cold. I don't even think they'll like super hot, really. Some of the benefits of them, though, like I'd mentioned earlier about the 50% discharge rate on my flooded lead acid. Well, these lithiums, you can go all the way down to like 90%. You can take 90% out of them and still get your charge back. And they charge back quicker. So that helps if you're in like, especially in winter, you know, you lose a lot of sunlight hours in the winter if you're in an area with a lot of trees, you know. So lithiums are good. You know, they last longer. They'll last 10 years plus. They'll outlast your inverter, maybe, you know. Like most of the solar gear is rated for 10 to 25 years, panels, everything. But batteries are just something. It's a recurring expense, you know. The better you buy is the less often you have to buy. So you have to take that into account also. They are the newest, and they are constantly evolving and coming down in price. It's a recurring cost. Flooded lead acid are pretty common. That's what I'm running. It's kind of like your 12-volt battery on your car. Although nowadays they're mostly sealed. Maybe they're putting AGM. But the old school flooded lead acid, they have sealed and they have non-sealed. Mine are not sealed, so they do require some occasional maintenance in the form of adding distilled water. And my inverter has a setting on it called desulfation, which kind of just gives like a really nice controlled high charge to be able to kind of cook off the plates, get some of the gunk metal off, and it runs. So, you know, and there's other things you can add to it to do that, you know, but they are maintenance, and you can maintenance them and extend their lives. There's like AGM batteries, which is like absorbent glass mat, and that's like kind of, I mean, you know, again, I haven't explored much in the property in these technologies other than to read about them and see that it was more than I wanted to spend, because really you don't want to spend $1 million on your system when you're just learning. You're gonna fry it out like I did. I fried mine out. I lost my first system to mice. I had my cables nowhere. They were just, you know, everything was just thrown around, and I guess they coat the cables in vegetable oil, so the mice enjoyed them much. They even ate the fat 2-gauge battery cable. So it was a couple of years after I had power from that. Now it's all flown and buried deep. You'll need a stand. You'll definitely want to secure your stuff. I bought a shed to put everything in, the control room as I call it. You know, a stand for the panels, whether you're going to just sit them flat, or you're going to tilt them south, or even one of them fancy tracking systems, because they're not even that much to do that. You know, it's a few $100, and tracking system. Mine are flat. I chose flat because I live in a motorhome, and everyone in a motorhome puts them on their roof, and they're flat. So I'm standing strong, holding the line. The batteries, the inverter, and the charge controller, you're kind of going to want them all close to each other. That's going to minimize that big fat 2-gauge cable that you got to buy. That stuff's expensive. Terminal ends, all that stuff adds up. You'll spend $1,000 cabling your system. And from your inverter, you're going to want to be within 100 feet of where you're needing that power, because then you're going to be starting with your cables again. You know, it's all about the cables. It's all about the cables. Low voltage, thin, fine strand. High voltage, solid. The last mention is grounding. The inverter will have a ground on it. You're going to need to just run a solid copper cable and a pipe into the ground. Wherever along the way it can be grounded. I put a little rod on the solar stand. I'll be grounding the wind turbine because you don't want that even entering your room, you know? All right, well, if you made it this far, thank you. You're a trooper. I know I said 10 minutes, but power is a lot. I hope I made it somewhat understandable, at least enough to begin searching. I hope including my system details helped in understanding the calculations better than me just rattling off formulas and numbers. I'll need to do a whole other turbine power video, as there's just a bunch of other things I gotta add to it along the way, and it's really big. It's like a big cable. It's 12/6, so it's 6 strands of 12 gauge, and it's low voltage, so it's fine strand. I mean, it's 3/4 of a pound per foot, 75 pounds for the 100-foot cable that I had to buy. So that'll be a fun one, but that's gonna be its own video. Until then, just remember, you're in low voltage. It's just be a mild buzz at best. Wear nice plastic or nice thick-soled shoes, and don't try this alone. All right, sorry it's so long, but it's power. I got a headache just sitting here filming that, so I'm not even doing it again. I love this take. Thank you, y'all. Stay peaceful. Have a great day. Thank you.